Okay, so if you're familiar with the Django user model, you'll know that Django by default has a very simple user model, which only really includes a few fields. That might be the username, the first name, the last name, email, password. So for the majority of projects that you work on, you'll probably want to extend this and add more items into the user model. So welcome back to a new Django tutorial. So in this one, we're going to be building a new custom user model or developing a new custom user model. So we're going to just get rid of the Django original model for users, and we're going to build our own. And there's a few things that we're going to add here. So instead of having the default username as the actual primary attribute to log into the system, for example, we're now going to change that to email. So we're going to use the email as the username, and then we're going to add a different username. So that will also be unique in the system. So the idea here is that the username has a unique email address, which they only use for logging in. While they're in the system, the user will have a unique username, which they can use for making comments, etc. Okay, so you can see the flow or the coverage of this tutorial. We're going to build a custom model manager, which we are then going to be utilizing on a new user model, which we build with extended fields. And then we go ahead, once we've completed that, to customize the Django admin interface. So we'll go through some of the tips, give you some tips and ideas of how you might want to extend the Django interface with this new model. And then finally, we'll do some testing of the new model. So something I'll bring in or start to bring into all the tutorials is just quickly give you an overview of the different packages. You can just skip this quickly if you don't need this information, or you can just refer back to it if you are having problems. Of course, most of the tutorials will have a requirements file, but if you're not familiar with that, you can see all the different packages that we're going to be utilizing in this tutorial, so that if you do have problems, first thing maybe is to try and match the packages versions so that you know that you're working with exactly the same packages that I'm showing you within the tutorial. So I'm going to start this tutorial on a brand new Django project. It's always recommended, particularly if you're new to this type of development, that you try this type of development out first on a new project before you might want to start integrating it into a project that's already started. Of course, we are making a number of different changes here, which you would then need to update, of course, your existing project, and that can cause numerous problems. So I'm just going to go ahead and start and build a new application. If you look in the commands text here, I'm not going to show you this process, but if you look in the commands text in the project documentation or the code repo on GitHub, there's a link in the description. You'll see all the different commands that I've utilized here, and you'll be able to replicate them. Once we start doing testing, etc., you'll see all the different testing commands that I've utilized to inflict or start the testing and so on. So by all means, have a look at the commands.txt file in the code repository. Okay, so you can see what's happened here. We've created a new project. This is going to be the core, the main project. And then we've created a new project folder, or a new application folder, sorry, called users, and we're going to be working inside of here. So there's no need for URLs here or anything like that. This is pretty much all that we're going to need to showcase creating a new user model. Okay, right, step one then. Let's go ahead and just make a new model. So you might want to use a completely different model as we move along here. So you can see that we're in the core, or sorry, the users model file. And I've just gone ahead and created some different elements here. I'll explain these yellow components in a second. We'll build those in. But I've got a new model here called new user. I'm going to be utilizing email, username, first name, start date, about. Of course, here you can start to add more. I've also included is staff and is active. So I am trying to follow the existing Django model in that we know that behind the scenes, we will have is staff and is active flag. So we want to also produce that or include that in our new user. So we've got two imports here. We've got the time, because obviously I'm utilizing time right here to set the start date. So we're generating a time or a date time field from the time zone package that we're importing in. And secondly, we're using getTextLazy. Okay, so we've not mentioned this before, but this is something that I utilize all the time in my models because most of the time you would expect your application online to potentially be translated into other languages. So simply put, I would utilize this at any point in my project where I think that data might be translated by the end host. Or indeed, we might allow the system to translate the data into the end user's language. So if you just read through this translation documentation here in Django, it says here, it's your responsibility to mark translatable strings. The system can only translate strings it knows about. Okay, so we're not about to translate the fields of the database. So we don't need to actually change the names of the fields of the database. But where we might want to provide translation is, for example, if we provide help text to users, or for example, reference text to fields in the database, and so on. So I've just planted the seed there. By all means, have a look at the translation documentation in Django, particularly the getLazy or getTextLazy here. And you can see it gives us provides us an example of how to actually import this in. So here we have import getTextLazy, and then we get as underscore. So instead of us writing getTextLazy, like for example, this example here, in actual fact, we just use as and then the underscore, and then we can just go ahead and just change these into the underscore, obviously referencing the getTextLazy. And you can see here that I'm using it on the reference points for the actual fields. So this is something that can be utilized within the system and be translated. Obviously, like I said, I'm not actually translating the actual name here, email, because then there'd be problems. The field's always going to be called email in the database. Okay, so other things to point out at this point is the fact we've got the email as unique and also the username as unique. So we are expecting those two fields to be unique in the database. And then we have the first name, which should be probably defined as unique unless we define it as blank equals true. So that should now be okay. And we can now move on. Of course, you can start to build this up as much as you like and add some more fields, etc. So this is where we are customizing. This is the new user table that we're now customizing. So like I said, by all means, add some more fields here. Okay, so now we need to start thinking about actually integrating it within Django or telling Django that we're using a custom user model. So here's some information in the customizing, specifying a custom user model. Essentially what we need to do is we need to utilize AbstracBaseUser and we need to extend from there. So that's what we need to do. So we need to first of all just import this into our project. So we go ahead and we're just going to import from the auth models, the abstract user base. So we'll extend that shortly, but we then just need to add that or drop that into our model to extend from it. So you can see we're adding our new fields. So as it specifies here, we need to define the username field. So this is going to be the unique identifying field that we're going to be utilizing for our new user model. Now, if you remember, the default username field is username. So obviously we want to change that to email. So let's go ahead and just add that first. And then that's the first parameter that we need to set. So next up is the required fields. So this essentially is a list of fields names that would be prompted when the user creates a new super user. So because we want the super user to also fill in the username or to complete the email username first name, for example, we also just need to specify that. So let's go ahead and specify the username. Notice that I've not mentioned email here, simply because there's no need to, because you would think that by default that would be a default option. So because username isn't a default option, I'm just going to add that into the required fields then specify that when we create a new super user, we also have to complete the username, because it is a unique key that needs to be completed by all users. Okay, so let's just finish this off by the dunder string here. And we're just going to return the username. By all means, you could return the email and so on. I've just selected the username. So in future tutorials, we'll go through potentially different permissions that we can define straight off here. But what we're going to do is just utilize the default permission mixin and include that in the actual creation of users so that we can hook into and utilize the permission facilities that Django has. So we just move across and import AbstractUser and then the PermissionsMixin. So we need to just also add this in. So this won't work in actual fact if we don't utilize the PermissionsMixin. So I did previously have made a video previously about the PermissionsMixin. So the final step here before we add our own custom manager is to include the PermissionsMixin. So as it says here, to make it easy to include Django permission framework into your own user class, Django provides the PermissionsMixin. So here, essentially what we're doing, we're just hooking up the users to the Django permission system or framework. So we need to do that by just adding in the PermissionsMixin here, and then we're just going to include it in the class here. So yeah, to summarize, this isn't going to work unless you add the user to the PermissionsMixin. So it is a necessary step. Okay, so now we're going to write a manager for our new custom user model. So if you read the document, it says that we need to use the user manager if we're using the Django default fields that are defined in the default user table. But because we're not, then we're defining our own custom fields, then we're going to need to use the BaseUserManager. So while we're doing that, why we need that is because we want to use these methods here, the create user and the create super user. And by doing so, essentially, we're just going to tell Django that we're utilizing new fields, or we've got more fields in our authentication table. So let's bring in the base manager. So we need that. And then we go ahead and create a new manager. So we're going to call this a custom account manager, and we're going to extend from the BaseUserManager. So here we're going to need two functions like I've just shown you. So first of all, we'll create the create user function and deal with what needs to happen when we create a new user. And then in addition to that, we'll just overwrite or just flesh out what we need to do if we want to overwrite the super user when we build a new super user. So let's just first concentrate on the create user. So let's just pass in the details into this function. So we want to first add in the self, email, username, first name, and password. So that's essentially what the user is going to have to complete to sign up to the system. And then in addition to that, we've also got the option of other fields, so we can include that in. So now we've got that in place. So let's just flesh out this. So we're going to ultimately return the user. So we want to, first of all, just deal with the email address. So we're going to normalize the email. So as it says here, we just basically normalize the email address by lowercasing the domain part of it. Just to prepare that, then we take in the user details. So here we've got the email, username, first name, and then in the other fields that we may have defined. And then we go ahead and create or set the password, and then save all that data, and then return the user. So here we can perform some validation checks, and this will help support our testing. So let's just validate, for example, the email. So if we don't include an email, you can see here we're going to get a value error. You can see that I'm going to use the get text lazy. So I'll start off like that so you realize what's going on if you've forgotten that I'm using the underscore. And then it just says you must provide an email address. So that's just an example there of other validation checks you might want to perform. It's going to produce a value error. And like I said, we'll utilize that in our testing. Okay, so now let's move over to create super user. So this is what's going to happen when we create a super user. So we take in self again. So we want the super user to enter the email, their username and their first name. and a password. And then we're going to collect any other fields. So this is an example of other fields. For example, with the super user, we want to set the isStaff to true, and we also want to set the super user to true. That's obviously a different process than if we're just creating a normal user. So we go ahead and also activate. So we set them to isActivated. Now notice that down here, that the normal user I've set to false when they create an account. So the reason why that is because I'm presuming you may have some sort of secondary check. For example, an email will be sent to the user. They need to click on that, and then that activates their user and they can then log in. So that's why the original user is set to false in this example. Of course, you can set it to active if you want, if you don't want that additional step in your system. So let's go ahead and create some checks here. So we're just going to check to make sure that the staff has been set. Otherwise, we're going to produce a value error. So again, we utilize this in our testing and check this in our testing. And again, we can do the same thing for the isSuperUser. If it's not true, then we're going to produce an error. And then we'll just return that. So self.createUser. And then we're just passing everything that we're returning. There we go. So that's going to create a super user. So let's just take a look at this. If we go into the Manage Pi and then create super user, we seem to have a problem at the moment. So it says no such table auth user. So there are a few other steps in case you have done that and you're wondering what the problem is. There are some other steps that need to be taken here. So we need to tell Django now the fact that we're going to be utilizing this table. Then obviously we're also going to need to migrate this table before we can get it to work. So let's remember first of all that our model is called new user. So we need to tell Django that we're utilizing this model. Now we haven't actually told this model to utilize this manager yet. And remember, we need to do that. So in actual fact, I've moved this in the wrong place, haven't I? So let's just make sure that this function here is actually inside of the class. And of course, it just needs to be moved across. Okay, so make sure that, apologies, that was in the class. So that should be in the custom account manager class. So now we've got our new two functions here, create super user and create user. We can now add this to our new user. So to do that, we'd simply just say objects equals, and then our new custom account manager. So we're just defining the fact we're using a new custom manager. So let's just go ahead and put that there. Moves that across. So we define the fact we're using a custom account manager. So that's been pulled in there. And then we can go ahead and then go into our main project folder and go into settings. And then we need to tell Django that we're utilizing this new model. So here we're going to define the auth user model and then users. That's the new application. And then the model is the new user model. Okay, so let's just double check to make sure that we've actually imported the project. So we need to install that. So this should just be users. So we're just adding this into the installed apps. So at this point, we should be now ready to test this out. So what we can do is just go ahead and do a dry run just to make sure that everything's going to work. It looks like we're able to migrate this data. So let's go ahead now and actually make migrations. And then, of course, we want to migrate. So at this point, there shouldn't be any problems. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just try and create a new super user. So this isn't going to work just yet. And I'm just going to ask you why you think that is. So let's create a new super user. And so it looks like it's working okay. We're going to take in the username, the password, and then we're going to get an error. So it's missing one required positional argument. So just take a look at the code for a couple of seconds if you can spot the problem. I did mention it at the start of the tutorial, And then one of the different parameters that we set actually defines what we're going to make the super user fill in. So at the bottom here, if you remember the required fields, so we defined the username, but we haven't actually defined the first name. So let's go ahead and just add that in, first name, and let's just try this again. Just remember that if we move up here, we are actually taking the first name into the create super user, and we are expecting it at the bottom here when we create the user. So let's just try this again. So this time we're actually typing in the first name, which didn't happen the first time we tried, and then the password, and there we go. So let's just take a look at what this looks like. Let's run the server and log in. So if we go ahead and log in, we should be able to log in now, at least, but the fields in the admin area probably won't line up to what we need. So first of all, obviously we need to actually import this in the actual model because it's not available at the moment. So the reason I'm showing you this, because if you remember, the default Django admin, so the default Django users automatically will appear in here. You don't actually need to add them to the Django administration. So let's go ahead and go into the admin. So again, we're in users. We're going to go to the admin, and now let's just add our model. So we're going to just start off by just adding the model. So we've added the model now to the admin, and we refresh, and we can now see the admin model, or the new user model that we created. So if we go in here, we should have one user. That's what we just created, the super user. You can see that this is looking a little bit bare. There's no other information. So we need to potentially add some more functional information here. So if I go into the user, we can see that we've got the groups that we can apply and so on. Looks very similar. And you can see down here, we do have the username and first name and the about here. So that is being picked up automatically, or the new fields. So this is what's going to be completely different, or it is different from the original users table. You can see that we still have his staff and active. So we do have a functional view, but we can definitely change this to make it a little bit more functional for us. Now, if we try to add a new user, notice what we're seeing here when we try and add a new user. Well, there's a bunch of stuff here in actual fact, but again, we could probably customize this. It does have all the fields. So we start off with the password. We can define super user status, the groups, email, username, first name, and about us. But potentially we could change this around to make it a little bit more functional for our needs. So if you're not interested in customizing the admin configuration here, then by all means just skip this step. And if you're interested in the testing, then just move to the testing phase of this tutorial. But essentially all I'm going to do now is just go over and give you some idea of how you might want to customize the interface. So I'm going to build a new class here. Well, I built a new class here called user_admin_config, takes in the user admin, and then we've gone ahead and admin site register. We've got taken in the new user model and then the user admin config. So we've tied all that up, and now we can start configuring. So let's start off by ordering all of the different users and defining what we want to actually display. So here we have ordering and list display. So if we go back into our page and we refresh, we can now see we've defined what we want to display here. Email, username, first name is active and is staff. And we can now also order it by, in this case, start date, by ascending or descending, however we want to display the ordering. So maybe we need some sort of search facility in our admin. So we add search fields, email, username, and first name. So you're going to be able to search based upon those fields there. So now we have the search facility. So typically you'll want to filter. So at the moment we've got filter by staff, super user status, and by active. So let's go ahead and define a little bit of filtering. So we're going to be able to filter on the email, username, first name is active and is staff. So that's the filter list. So if I refresh now, you can see we've added some different filters. Okay, so if we go into the user, you can see that in actual fact, there's a bit of a problem here. So let's go ahead and just define some new fields here. So what we're going to do now is define the field sets. So here you can see I've got 3 areas. I've got the top section here, I've got the permissions, and I've got the personal information. So I've separated this into 3 separate areas. So if we go back and refresh, we now see we have 3 separate areas. Top area here, permissions, and personal, which I've just defined. So it just nicely displays everything that I might want to see. Of course, it is functional. Beforehand, we saw that everything was there, but this just looks a little bit more tidy and maybe fit for purpose, whatever that might be in your application. So it is possible to actually change the styling right here. So for example, what we can do is import the model and then use the form field overrides and then define some form field overrides, in this case for the text area. So that's something else that we can add. And then finally, what you might want to also change is when we add a new item. So you can see it's broken at the moment because we've made some changes. So let's just go ahead and define that. So we're going to add a field set. So you can see here we've got classes wide, fields, email, username, first name, password, and password too. So those are the fields that we're going to define. Is active and his staff is going to be available when we create a new user. So if I refresh, you can now see all the fields in place in the particular order that I've set. Email, username, first name, password. Notice that this is in bold because it's defining the fact it's a mandatory field, whereas first name isn't mandatory. Here we could also add the bio and any other fields that you want to include that's in your model. So the final step here is we're just going to go over some testing of this model. Now we're going to be utilizing coverage to do that, and we suggest some other testing that we can do on the model. So let's go ahead and first install the coverage package, and I'll just go through that again if you're not familiar with that. So we've installed coverage, and then the next thing to do is just to run it. So here you can see I've created a command where we actually omit the VENV server, or sorry, the VENV or the virtual environment folder. So if I do tests on this folder, what's going to happen is it's going to look into the virtual environment folder and do the tests on that as well, or find tests that need to be done in that folder, which isn't ideal or needed in this situation. So if your virtual environment folder isn't here, then you're not going to need to omit that. And obviously, if you've got other folders here, then this is obviously the way to do that. So I'm going to run coverage. This is going to give me an idea of what tests I might need to run. So now I just run the coverage HTML. And that's going to create a new folder here called HTML_cov. Inside of here is a index file. Just go ahead and run that index file in your browser. And it should look a little bit like this. So you can see here that, for example, our users model is missing 16 tests. There's only 54% coverage. So here we are. So this gives us an idea, if you're new to testing, of what potentially needs to be tested. Of course, if you're going to take other testing approaches, you've probably done the testing first before you actually built the model. But for now, we're just going to work this way. So we've got 16 missing tests. So now let's go ahead and think about what we need to test, how we're going to test it, so that we can get this down to 0 and 100% tested. So if we go into the users, and there should be a file here called test.py. So if there isn't, then just make it test.py, and then we're going to import the test case and start from there. Okay, so back into the manual, it says referencing the user model. So whereas before we may have referenced the user model slightly differently when we import the model into one of our views, etc., here, because we've made some changes and we're using a different user model, we're going to reference the user model by getUserModel. So in order to do some testing, we need to import our new model. So that's done by the contrib auth, and then we're importing, like I said, getUserModel because we're using a custom model. So that's obviously being picked up by our settings file. So in the settings, if you remember, at the bottom, we added our auth user model as users.newUser. So that's where it's all being connected. So let's go back into testing. So we need to add that in first, and then we're going to create our new test case. So let's just quickly run through this. So we're going to create a new function here called test new superuser. So that's essentially what we want to do first. We want to test the super user. So let's go ahead and create the database, or get the database. And then we're going to create some new data. Remember, we're using the testing database, not the real database here. So we're going to reference this as super user. And you can see here, we're going to create some data. So we've manually created some data for our database. We need the email, username, first name, and password. Remember, that matches the model and what's expected from the super user when we create a new super user. And then we go ahead and do some testing. So we use the assert equals here. So obviously, if we create a new user, the super user, that's the database, and then the email inside of this new entry in the database, it should match, or it should equal to testuser@superuser.com. So this is going to test to see if the test user has been successfully entered into the database. And then we can do the same for the other items, the username, the first name, and password, test to see if that's been inserted correctly. And then we can test to see if it's actually a super user. So when we create a super user, is it actually being assigned super user? So we can test for that. So assert true. So this should be true. So super user, referring to the user we just created, is super user. So they should be super user. And then we then test to see if they're staff. And then we assessed if it's true if they're active. So that should be true. And then what we can do is just assess the string, return string. So if you remember in the models, we're just going to test this here. It's done the string method here. So we're just returning the username. So we should be returning the username when we create a new user. So go back into test. So here the username is username. So if we created this user in the dunder method here, we should be returning the user name. So the username is the name of the user. Apologies if that wasn't clear. So these string items here, attributes, are actually what we're entering into the database. So that would be whatever, first name and so on. So I've just used username, first name, and password. So we test for that. Okay, then we can then test some more things. So this is going one step further, really, whether this is needed. Just to get you to start thinking about what else we can test. Now, if you look in the model, what we've done here is we've created we've raised some value errors if certain conditions are met. So we can utilize these in our testing. So for example, if we were to test this, it should raise a value error. And that's what we're checking for, and that's what we're capturing now in this test. So with self-assert raises value error, we're going to basically pretend we're going to insert this data here into the database, and it should cause an error. So the question is, why should it cause an error? Apologies if it's too small, but here it says, is super user equals false? So obviously it should equal true. So we're testing for that condition here. So super user is true. So we're raising this value error here. Super user must be blah, blah, blah. And that's what we're essentially testing for right there. Okay, so then we can go ahead and create another value error for the other tests we have in our model. And this time we're testing, for example, raises error. Sorry, asserts raises value error. So where's the value error here? Obviously it's is staff equals false. So again, that just matches the model and so on. So we can then go ahead and test some more things if we wanted to, if the email was missing, and so on if we wanted to. But that's just some examples really for you to start thinking about what you might want to test there. And then we can go on and test the user. So the user is slightly different what we want to test, because although we enter the same information, so we use this time user, test user, and the items. But this time, if you remember, we don't set the user to super user. So first of all, we just test their email to make sure that that equals testuser.com. And we can do the same thing for username, first name. So we do that. And then we just test to make sure that the user isn't super user. So we say is super user. That should be false. So assert false. So that should be true. And then we do the same thing as staff. And then active. So remember that active should be false by default when we create a user. Remember why I did that was because when we create a user, my system's going to have a second step where I email the user. They need to click on that link. That link takes them to a page that authenticates the user. and then sets the active is true, and then they can log in. So they won't be able to log in the system unless the user is active. Okay, so let me go ahead and do an assert raise value error. So same type of principles here. I'm going to test that if I insert some data and I miss some data out, that we cause an error. And so I'm going to capture that. So the email is missing. Oh, and the email is missing, sorry. And there we go. So that's just some simple tests that you might want to create on this model. Okay, so let's go ahead now and run the test again. So we coverage run. So we've done some tests. We ran 2 tests. So the tests we've run are obviously the class user account test, the function here, test new super user, that's one test, and all the different items. And then we've bunched all these tests up here in the test new user. So there's no problems there. So let's now go into the coverage HTML, and we should now be able to open up the page again. So this is where we were. So I just need to refresh this page. We had 16 missing, refresh. We've gone to 100 now, and there's no missing tests. So obviously this coverage package provides us a guidance. It doesn't always provide us or give us guidance to every test we might want to do or choose to perform. But it is a good way of starting testing, a visualization of what needs testing in your application. Okay, so there we have it. We've created a new custom user model in Django. We've now changed the system, changed Django so that it utilizes the email as the old username in the system. So that's the key or the main primary item that the user utilizes to identify the user. And of course, we then made the username mandatory still. So when we create a new username or user, sorry, they need an email and a unique username. So at the moment, we aren't capturing that. That's one point that you could look at this and improve upon. And we probably need to then move into the back end and create a view of actually building this. Because remember, all we've done is made a model. We haven't actually instructed Django in the view, for example, the logic that's required to actually maybe perform some changes or perform some actions. So let me just clarify that. So for example, if we go into, if we create a new user, if I can just grab that. Okay, I need to type it in. So if we were to create a new super user, we will find that Django will still offer us errors. So in the background, Django is still in control with utilizing the similar code if we were using the original user table, still providing us some errors and so on. So we can obviously manage this. And something that we will want to manage is that, for example, I won't set up now, but if you were to go ahead and create 2 users and make the username, remember it needs to be unique in this system, the same, then you would get a slightly different error. It won't, Django by default won't capture that error and display it like it would do if you had an email unique issue. So that's something that we'd need to create a custom view potentially for. And that's something we can definitely do in another tutorial. Of course, that type of thing can be captured in your form and in your view when you're actually building the authentication system and the interface for your system. So that can be captured elsewhere, of course. Okay, there we go. Hopefully there was some value there and you've learned something new, and you can now go ahead and start implementing that into your applications. So this represented a little bit of a deeper tutorial in that I provided a little bit more testing, or we'll try to apply testing or give you guidance on what or how to test in future tutorials now. If you're not too sure about testing, I did start a testing tutorial series. So have a look at that series also to kind of give you some additional guidance on testing. Again, thank you for listening and for your support so far. And hopefully I'll see you in the next tutorial.